Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakio, and the title of today's talk is The Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, Part 3. This is the third in a four-part series on the Four Noble Truths and how they can help us in daily life. But before we get into that, I'd like to remind you to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. Also, if you'd like to do a deep dive into the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, I'd encourage you to check out my book, Perfectly Ordinary: Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. I've placed a link to a sample chapter of the book in the description for this talk. Now, the third noble truth of Buddhism states, the way to end suffering is to end desire. And that's a bit of a misnomer because, as I've said previously, we can't eliminate all desire from our life. It's just a natural part of being a human being. But that's why suffering is also a natural part of our life. They go together. It should also be noted that in Buddhism, we oftentimes use exaggeration in order to make a point. So, for example, in the Vimalakirti Sutra, we're told that there were 1 billion deities in Vimalakirti's hut on the night he passed away and gave his final teaching. Now, were there literally that many people inside the hut before he died? Probably not. But that was Buddha's way of saying that there were a lot of people involved. Similarly, when he says the way to end suffering is to end desire, what he's stating is factually true. However, what he's really instructing us to do is to investigate each of our desires and learn how to work with them skillfully. So he's giving us something to work towards rather than something that we should literally do. And how we do this, how we work with our desires skillfully, will be the subject of today's talk. Now, when I did a meta-analysis of the Buddhist sutras and the Buddhist discourses on desire and suffering and how we should deal with them, I found that Buddhist teachings always fall into one of three categories when he's speaking about desire. He either instructs us to accept our desire and the suffering that comes with it. He instructs us to reduce our desire, thus reducing the suffering that comes with it. Or he instructs us to renounce our desire, thus eliminating the suffering that comes with it. And which teaching we should use varied depending on the subject matter at hand. For example, he once had a woman named Kisa Gatami come to him, hoping that he could bring her dead son back to life. The Buddha said that he would do this, but only if she could find a household that had never lost a loved one. In other words, a household where no one had ever died. Now, she went on her quest. She tried to find a household, but naturally she failed because eventually death comes for us all. And in this way, she learned that she had to practice acceptance towards her desire for her son. She wanted him to come back to life, which is a perfectly natural thing for a mother or a father to want. However, she had to accept that that wasn't going to happen. And when she did that, when she practiced acceptance, her suffering didn't go away completely, but it did lessen. So that's one way to deal with desire. Next, we have reduction. So there are 4 things that the Buddha found were necessary for life. We need them to live. This is the desire for food, the desire for shelter, the desire for clothing, and the desire for medicine. The Buddha tried to renounce all of these things early in his practice, and he almost died as a result. So, instead of telling his followers that they should renounce these things, he said that they should work with them skillfully. So, for example, we all have a desire for clothing. Perfectly natural thing. We would all freeze to death or get wet if it was raining if we didn't have clothing, right? So what do? Because our desire for clothing naturally causes suffering in the harvesting of the cotton, in the putting together of the clothing, the dyeing, etc. Well, maybe we buy less clothing and we only buy the things we need instead of buying something just because it's fashionable or on sale. Maybe after we buy clothing, we try to make it last longer by repairing it with patches or with sewing, as opposed to immediately buying something new. In this way, we reduce our need for clothing by buying less of it, but we don't renounce it completely. Instead, we practice acceptance and reduction. So it's kind of a team effort. And in this way, we reduce the amount of suffering associated with this desire. Finally, we have renunciation. And this is probably the practice that people most associate with Buddhism, because Buddha and his monastics practiced quite a bit of renunciation in their day-to-day life. Now, we as lay practitioners obviously do this a bit less, but renunciation is still something that we should look to from time to time, because some desires are just so damaging that the suffering simply isn't worth it. So, for example, with the desire for sex, sexual desire is a natural part of life. Now, Buddha and his monastics practiced renunciation towards sex because they wanted to take all of that creative sexual energy and put it into their practice. We as lay people probably don't do that. So what do we do instead? We practice reduction and renunciation, meaning we reduce our sexual desire by only using it in the confines of a committed monogamous relationship, and we renounce having sex with people we're not in a relationship with. So why do we do this? Well, I've met a lot of people who've suffered quite a bit because their partner had sex with someone who was not them. In other words, their partner cheated on them. I've never counseled or spoken with someone who was suffering because their partner only had sex with them. So it's not the sexual act per se that's the cause of suffering. It's who we choose to have sex with. And that's where the skillfulness comes in. Another example may be alcohol. So a lot of suffering is caused every year because of alcohol. So we may choose to renounce alcohol altogether. We just don't want to deal with it. This is something I do in my own practice, and it's worked out pretty well. But I understand that's not for everyone, and it's not required if you want to practice Buddhism, assuming that you're not a monastic. So what do we do instead? Well, maybe we choose to drink, but we don't get drunk. Right? So instead of renouncing our desire for alcohol completely, we reduce it. We drink responsibly, and as a result, we reduce the suffering that's also associated with it. So, those are the three ways we deal with our desire, according to the third noble truth of Buddhism. We practice acceptance, we practice reduction, or we practice renunciation. If we do these three things, and work skillfully with our desires, will greatly reduce or eliminate the suffering in our lives, and everyone will be happier as a result. So that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. If you'd like to read articles I've written about Buddhist practice, you can do that at my blog, The Same Old Zen, which is at thesameoldzen.com. If you have comments or additional questions, I encourage you to leave a comment in the comments section below. I promise I'll respond. I love to hear from you guys. So until next time, Amitabha.